Hey! Charlie! Somebody got that, that's good. So how I like to run my guest of honor gigs is if, when I'm giving a speech, this will be a short, maybe 20-minute speech, followed by Q&A. Because I can blab forever, but I found that my period of time given to blabbing is directly proportional to how boring I get. And so, it's a parabolic scale. And so I want to avoid being too boring. A little bit of boring is impossible to avoid since I'm a college professor and this is just what we do. But there's one topic that I like to talk about. And it's something that I've thought quite a bit about. It's somewhat important to me. And it starts with Columbus. This is actually a story about me. It starts with a story about me. So when I was in grade school, I was taught a story about Columbus, where he was sailing over across the ocean, and all of his, he believed that he would find, they didn't talk about it being Indian, he believed he'd find something important. And all of his sailors who were with him, the story goes, were like mutinous. And they're like, this is craziness, we're going to fall off the side of the planet, right? You may have heard this story. And they mutinied and convinced them to continue on, and lo and behold, they discovered the new world and, fun and rainbows or whatever. Has anyone heard this story about the sailors mutinying and the whole edge of the world and things like that? How many of you that are raising your hand know that that is complete fabrication? Yeah, I'm slow on the uptake. I didn't figure this out until about 3 or 4 years ago. Because, you get told these things when you're a kid, and you just accept them as reality, right? You just believe it. And it wasn't until I was reading in a book of essays where someone had written an essay about why this urban legend started. It was actually started by Washington Irving, the Sleepy Hollow guy. It was politically motivated. It was a dig against, and I can't even remember why. It was a religiously political thing where he wrote this story in order to kind of undermine a certain religious group or whatnot. Anyway, it's complete fabrication. In fact, the level of fabrication is kind of baffling because basically, and I hadn't known this, basically everyone throughout history has known that the Earth is round. Nobody's really ever believed it's flat. At least not anybody with any sort of education. That includes primarily sailors, right? Sailors can see the curve of the ocean. They know that the Earth is round. They've always known, all the way back when. You can go back to Greek times and they talk about, just as a given fact, Earth is round. Everybody knows this. Which just blew my mind when I read that. Because I'm like, well, here I had thought that everybody before us was kind of, we were the enlightened ones, and they hadn't known what's going on. And yet to believe that, I had to be willing to believe that sailors who could see the curve of the Earth as they were sailing still had to believe that there was some drop-off point where they'd fall off the Earth, and that the Earth was flat. I had to believe that they were ridiculously incompetent in order to satisfy my modern sensibilities of intelligence. And in fact, the real truth about the story with Columbus was they did mutiny because they had accurate records to show how big the Earth was, and he thought it was smaller, and he was wrong. Very wrong. And they're like, no, we know this. This is how big the Earth is. We're going to run out of food. We're going to die because you're sailing us, and if they had run into South America or whatever, they would have been right. And they would have starved and run out of fresh water because Columbus was wrong. Okay? Now, that's not a dig against Columbus. It's more a dig against Irvine, who wrote this story, and a dig against myself in a way for my willingness to believe that everyone before me was somewhat simple. Simple of mind. This is this is interesting to me. This concept sent me in a long series of thoughtfulness, actually relating to science fiction and fantasy. And why is this relating to science fiction and fantasy? Well, another story. If you guys heard of Sturgeon's Law? Who's heard of it? Raise your hands. I'll tell you what it is, and then maybe you'll recognize that Sturgeon's Law comes from from the quote by a science fiction writer, Theodore Sturgeon, who he quoted this, and he, as I've read the interviews, didn't really mean it. He was saying it facetiously, and yet it came across as law. He said 90% of everything is crap. The context for this was, he was arguing with people who were saying science fiction and fantasy are not true literature, and they were using, in his opinion, the worst examples of science fiction and fantasy to prove this. And he flabbergastedly was saying 90% of anything is crap. So why are you using the bottom of the barrel? Why aren't you using, Ursula Le Guin or some of these people who are writing this fantastic stuff? So this whole concept that 90% of everything is crap has entered into our vernacular. We talk a lot about this, and it becomes almost, I've seen quite often in science fiction and fantasy, it becomes our defense. It becomes our defense against people who criticize our genre. We say, well, you're looking at the terrible examples. The 10% is just as good in science fiction and fantasy as it is in anything else. I'm glad that people are defending science fiction and fantasy. I went through a bachelor's and a master's degree in literature programs, and let me tell you, I know what it's like to fight against people to prove that science fiction and fantasy has merit. I had to fight these fights every day. I took plenty of classes where the professors would come in, first day of class, and say, no science fiction and fantasy. They would just say that, and I would actually raise my hand and say, so what happens if we write it? And they're like, oh, I'll fail you. And I said, okay, fail me. I'm here to learn what I want to learn. I'll try the things you're teaching, but I write science fiction. I write fantasy. This is what I am. So if you want to fail me, go for it. And then I would write the best stuff I could, and none of them ever did. One gave me an A-. He was a poet, and we have an amicable relationship, and I kind of think he couldn't bear to give me an A, but he knew that I was right. I was actually turning in chapters of The Way of Kings at the time. This was and I don't think he could bear to give me a bad grade either, and so he settled on an A-. This is the same person that told me if I want to write great science fiction and fantasy, I should be reading 100 Years of Solitude, which is a great book. There's nothing wrong with 100 Years of Solitude. I did read it because I like to take the suggestions of my professor, and I like to try new things, and I like to try what they were talking about. I just believe I could do it in science fiction and fantasy just as well as what they wanted me to do it with. Anyway, I read this, a great book, but it's not the book I would say to study if you want to write fantasy. I would say, if you're interested in magic realism, and if you're interested in Hispanic culture and things like this, then yes, it's well worth reading. It's a great book, but anyway, we kind of had a difference of opinion. But anyway, nobody failed me. I actually managed to get my master's degree. I turned in a novel as my master's thesis, and they let me get away with it. The book was already published at the time, so I sold the book first year in my master's program, which kind of befuddled people, because then they didn't know what to do with it. But anyway, I know what it's like to fight for the rights of science fiction and fantasy. So I commend those who are arguing on our behalf. But I really worry about the way we've been doing it. I really worry about Sturgeon's law, because we seem to accept it as fact. We seem to accept as fact that 90% of what we are producing as a community is crap. That troubles me. That troubles me a whole lot, because what that means is we are believing as a community in science fiction and fantasy that 90% of the writers are either incompetent or are writing things that they don't actually think are good only to get a paycheck. I know a lot of the writers in this community, and I will tell you that I have rarely met either of those two. You would also have to believe that the editors are either incompetent, or they are only buying what they think will sell, and they're buying these things and reading them and thinking, this is utter dreck, but at least it will sell, for 9 out of 10 books, which I find very difficult to believe. If you don't know a lot about the business, science fiction and fantasy editors are among the best and most awesome people in the entire world. They really are. I've met these people, I've eaten dinner with these people, I've worked with these people. These are the ultimate science fiction and fantasy literature superstars. They take very small pay and recognition compared to what the authors get, in order to try and find and help make the genre better. My own editor, Moshe Fader, Moshe, his story is quite common among editors. He started as an editor because he loved one of the science fiction magazines. I can't remember if it was Analog or if it was Asimov's, but he was a super nerd, like a lot of us probably were in high school. And as a high school kid, he loved this so much he wanted to have a full collection, and he went over to the editor's house, because it was in New York, and he lived in New York, and wanted to buy back issues so he could have a full collection. And the editor said, okay, do you want to read for us? You seem like you're interested in this. And he became a free reader for the magazine, reading science fiction and fantasy and passing it on to the editors. And he did this for free for years. Then he eventually got a job for the Science Fiction Book Club. He worked there for years, worked up and got a very nice job in the Military Book Club. And then, years later, took an immense pay cut to go to Tor because he loved science fiction and fantasy and became an editorial assistant at the bottom rung to start over at Tor because he loves this genre.